Hello, I see we're getting started here. Glad you guys could join, but I think, we're just starting to get people in, so good to hang out for a minute or 5 more. Hi, Eric.
Hi.
Glad to see you there. It's going to take a while, looks like, for people to get cranking again.
I'm gonna, before everyone gets on, I'm just gonna share my screen once real quick to make sure there's
Sure,
no,
make sure that's fine.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
don't want it to crash anything,
Okay. I have your bio. Ben, were you planning to do anything, or do you want me to just do the bio, or were you going to do it?
I'll do it. I'll give a little more introduction on where this research is coming from that way with the
I'll
bio.
give you a very brief intro then of here's Eric, and then you take it away.
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay.
It looks like it worked on my end.
Oh yeah, mine too. That's great.
Great.
Super.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing now then.
Yeah,
Okay.
super.
I'm
That's
officially
great.
ready then.
Good, that's wonderful.
Thank you for
Right.
inviting me, by the way.
Oh, delighted. Delighted. I find it interesting work.
Thank you.
Absolutely. But it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 3:58 and change, so it'll take a while for people to get back on.
Yep, I prepared 8 extra slides of our postdoc work just in case there were no questions, because I usually get enough questions to fill the hour, but I'm like, end of day, I need a backup plan.
It's always that's always a good plan, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I do. That's a great plan. So we'll see how it goes here. There's Michelle. Although we did see a pretty good uptick at 4, I think if you have time, I think we can give it a few more minutes because.
Yes,
It does.
end of day, everyone's behind schedule.
Well, there's always trouble intermittently with electronics with almost everyone sooner or later. So I think it's good to allow a few minutes to let that sort out. Huh?
I agree.
Yeah. Somebody saying good afternoon. Good afternoon, Donna. Good afternoon to everybody. We're still just allowing time for everyone to get their get signed on, and that's just gonna take a few minutes, but then we'll be ready to go pretty quickly. There's Kyle. I think I saw Kyle briefly. There you are. Here. So, Kyle, before I introduce our speaker, do you have anything or any announcements to make to the group while we're just giving it that one last minute or two to make sure everybody gets on? Are we good?
No, just a reminder that Rec Scholar applications are out and due in, I don't know. I will put it in the chat. I will send the link in
Good.
the chat with the dates.
Perfect. It's great. Oh, so this is very good. Okay, well, you know, we probably may have a few more people join us, but in the interest of everyone's time, I think I'll go ahead and get things started if I could. Welcome, everybody. Another new exciting Ideas Forum. So glad you were all able to make it. It's terrific. And we do have a really interesting talk today. It's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Eric Griffith, I'm going to give him a very brief intro and let him talk about his research. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and an MA in psychology from Boston University. He completed his dissertation fieldwork in central Mexico, focusing on the experiences of familial caregivers for people living with Alzheimer's disease. And with that, I'm just going to let Eric take it over from there. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Great segue. So yes, I'm going to present a little bit of my dissertation research today from that project in Mexico. One of my chapters is coming up in January in an edited volume, and then I'm working on getting the others published. So I'm certainly open to feedback as you're seeing what I'm presenting, if you see anything that would benefit from some additional review. I just did the same presentation at Dr. Karlowicz's lab last week after he invited me after the ADRC conference or the symposium a few weeks back, and they had some really good feedback. So I've already made some modifications. So please, by all means, keep the critiques coming. I'll also insert spots for questions. And then if time permits, if my dissertation work doesn't take up the full hour, I have a little bit of presentation to give on the work that we're doing on the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on how religious experience affects Alzheimer's risk for Black people in the South. But we'll start with Mexico for now.
Terrific.
Share my screen. So Alzheimer's disease diagnosis seeking, Mexico and the United States, barriers and motivations. Slightly different title. I decided to focus in a little more on the diagnosis seeking part of my dissertation to keep things manageable rather than going over the whole thing. Let's dive right in. So I won't start. I assume this entire group knows what plaques and tangles are and knows how Alzheimer's disease works. So I'm going to save myself 3 minutes of going over what it is and just jump into my theoretical framework so that we're all on the same page of where I'm coming from as an anthropologist. And as someone with biocultural training, critical biocultural training, we look at illness and disease from a cultural perspective. We look at it as a social or cultural construction. In Alzheimer's disease, despite the in-brain elements, is no different. This was documented, not first necessarily, but most famously by an anthropologist named Lawrence Cohen in the 1980s and into the 90s. He wrote a book that won several awards called No Aging in India, and he documented how the ways that people talk about Alzheimer's disease differed substantially between rural and urban India. And then that had effects on how the people who had been diagnosed or who were being talked about were treated, which then affects their symptomatology and whatnot, which if anyone's familiar with Dr. Kitwood's work sounds very similar. So Kitwood theorized a personhood model of Alzheimer's disease, and he noted 17 malignant practices that were affecting patients in nursing homes specifically, but his big conclusion that aligns very well with the critical biocultural anthropological perspective is the idea that the way we treat patients then changes the way they act, which changes the way that we think about the disease that they have been diagnosed with. That's where we're coming from here. We're not doing an in-brain study. I'm doing more a talk about how people relate to someone who's living with Alzheimer's disease and then how that person relates back. Just to tie this in with people who are more on the molecular side of things, we see the social construction element when we talk about risk factors. So even if you take a purely in-brain, a purely biological determinist perspective on how these diseases form, and you say, I think this is entirely, for instance, in some people, 100% genetic, we still talk about how risk factors, so things that we do in our sociocultural environment affect our risk for developing dementia. So even on the more molecular side, I think there's some acknowledgement that the social milieu also is affecting how people with Alzheimer's disease are treated, and then in turn, how they're acting. Digging a little deeper there, we're going to talk a little more about the importance of diagnoses today and how diagnosis seeking behavior differs between the United States and Mexico. Just quick review, for especially in the United States, we say that an early diagnosis is very important for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias for several reasons. One reason is that there's an opportunity to medicate symptoms once you're diagnosed. You know, it's very hard to medicate a symptom if you're not going to the doctor on a regular basis, and that can make a big difference for caregivers. We hear a lot about, for instance, sleep disorders. Someone with a sleep disorder becomes a significant burden for a caregiver, and so maybe we can give them some type of medication to help keep the sleep more consistent and give that care partner a chance to, you know, stay rested and more alert during the day. We may be able to slow progress of certain types of dementia. So if someone has vascular dementia, we want to immediately get their hypertension under control, for example. Also, chances to educate the care partner or the family. What's going to happen to my spouse? What's going to happen to mom? How much longer are they going to live? Are they going to, quote unquote, lose their mind immediately? And so forth. Those conversations can open up once we have those diagnoses. And finally, that then leads to planning for the future. So, you know, estate planning, getting a hold of lawyers, power of attorney, and whatnot. And so the diagnosis seeking process has a significant impact on both the care partner and the person living with dementia and how they navigate the rest of the life of the person living with dementia. Now, just because diagnosis seeking is important doesn't mean it always happens right away. There's a lot of literature out there actually talking about how diagnosis seeking is often delayed for a number of reasons. For instance, here's one study from 1999 that found the average time between initial symptom recognition and diagnosis was 30 months, 2.5 years. 4 kinds of factors were identified as delaying diagnosis, including the caregiver's lack of knowledge, patient, family, and physician-related factors, and so forth. Similarly, this is another paper in 2019 that reported that nearly half, 47% of carers reported an earlier diagnosis would have been preferable. Delaying factors including reluctance of the persons with dementia, lack of awareness of dementia, etc. And so we have an understanding, you know, there's often a delay when someone starts to maybe show some cognitive decline and then when they actually go to the doctor. Now I want to jump in and talk a little more about Mexico specifically. So why are we talking about Mexico? And the answer is that if the numbers in Mexico are following a very similar trend to what we're seeing in the United States. We're seeing a demographic transition where there are where now the proportion of people who are living longer is increasing, and then also people are having fewer children, and so the proportion of people who are older in general is also increasing. We all know that demographic transition in Western Europe, Japan, and we're starting to see it in the US. Mexico is no exception. Accordingly, we're seeing an increase. This is an estimate from 2012, and this is from the 1066 group. And so they're estimating that the total number of cases of dementia are going to basically increase by 6 or 7-fold from 2010 to 2050. Now, let's talk a little more about that prevalence and how that overlaps with some of this diagnosis-seeking behavior that I was talking about a second ago. The reality is that the numbers we have so far suggest that ADRD is significantly underdiagnosed in Mexico, and particularly Alzheimer's disease. So this first study is an estimate based on the demographics of people living in Mexico. What percentage of the older population should be, or what should the prevalence be? And they're estimating around 6 to 8% of the people at risk should have a diagnosis of dementia. Now the question is, how many people, if that's, you know, the statistical estimate, how many people are actually being diagnosed? I actually really like this paper. It was like just a poster for like 5 years before they put it into a journal, so I could finally start citing it for real. And they did a survey of people who were admitted to, older people who were admitted to one of the, they call them EAMS, or actually this is the lower tier hospital system, one of the public hospitals in Mexico City. So they're saying, okay, we have a public hospital in Mexico City. We have a bunch of old people, 65 plus, in the hospital right now. Let's go in there and see how many of them are actually being diagnosed with dementia versus how many we would expect to be diagnosed with dementia based on some of these other findings. And they concluded that only 14.3% of the number of expected diagnoses that you would think you would get looking at the demographics had actually happened at that point in the hospital. And so a significant underdiagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in a central Mexico City hospital, a public hospital too. And the last thing I'll add before I get into my methods is that the care partner experiences in Mexico are not, from a qualitative perspective, have not been thoroughly documented. If you go to an Alzheimer's conference in Mexico, you'll see some posters on this. Most people haven't put the work into Spanish or English language journals yet. There's lots of support groups. There's plenty of there's some studies that are doing, for instance, a prevalence study. They're doing some genetic studies and whatnot, but these more qualitative findings about the care partner experiences have not been as built out within the Mexico research ecosphere as they have been in the United States. And so we don't necessarily understand why are the care partners maybe taking a little longer to go get a diagnosis in Mexico versus in the United States or another country. Here's my quick summary of that introduction. Muted myself, sorry. Rates of Alzheimer's disease are increasing worldwide, including Mexico and the United States. And early diagnosis is generally encouraged for managing the effects of the disease. Multiple countries report delays in obtaining a diagnosis, underdiagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in Mexico, and little is known about the care partner help-seeking experience in general. Here's the two research questions for today. How long after the onset of initial symptoms or changes, behavioral changes, do care partners seek out a diagnosis? And what symptoms or changes motivate care partners to seek out a diagnosis? And again, I'm comparing Mexico to the US. I'm not necessarily using the US as a reference population, but I think it's useful to ask the same question in both places and see what happens. So the field sites where I did this were in central Massachusetts and over into Boston as well. So mostly up and down the I-91 corridor. So I spent a lot of time driving around the Amherst region, into the Berkshires, down into Connecticut, and a couple times over into the North Shore, north of Boston. In Mexico, I was working in central Mexico, mostly in the city of Puebla and a little bit in Mexico City. I supplemented some of my recruitment going back and forth between the two cities. They're about 2 hours apart actually. So it was okay, it wasn't too bad. And here's where I actually was. So here's a map with some pinpoints of where I actually went. So you can see I did a few interviews in Mexico City, and most of my interviews were in this other city called Puebla, a little bit east of Mexico City. And then in Massachusetts, I was driving up and down I-91, headed over to Pittsfield a little bit, and then was up on the North Shore near New Hampshire. So the field site in Mexico that I chose was actually where my advisor did her field work. And this was like, my department was, they're pretty old school, like, go out there, do your field work at your site, and then come back to us with what you found. They're very supportive. It was a great experience. And one of the things that I liked about it was my advisor was like, you should go to Puebla. I have contacts there. I have someone you can live with. It's a big enough city. It's a city of about 3 million people that the people there will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, so that you have people to work with. And there's a number of hospitals. So there's lots of doctors, medical doctors that you could try to collaborate with. And then the last interesting thing about this particular city is that it's very university heavy. It's very similar to Boston in that there's a ton of universities in the area. So you get a huge number of more progressive-minded, younger people who stay there and find a job after they finish their undergraduate degree, mixed in with an older, more traditional population. The Catholic Church has a huge influence on anyone over the age of about 65 in this region. And many people did not have access to education when they were growing up from that generation and so forth. And so there's some parallels there where we have this commingling of the younger culture mixing with a more traditional older culture, but that means also there's tons of education in hospitals, so I can at least find people theoretically who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Whereas if I left a major city and went into a more rural area, it's very unlikely I would have been able to find people who had formal diagnoses, especially of Alzheimer's disease. So the United States recruitment followed the pattern that we all more or less know about, hang up flyers, make phone calls to some of the clinics in the area, go give a talk at the senior center. I did a lot of that, and just kind of through brute force, I eventually found enough families in the US was not too exciting or interesting. I didn't have to, I didn't have to resort to anything that's not pretty typical in the recruitment struggles that we all deal with. Mexico was a little bit different. And by a little bit different, I mean, it was a completely different experience. When I first went there to visit, to scope out the field site, I met with a psychologist who was just moving to Puebla from Mexico City. And I had a host family, and I just kind of taught, like I went to some, some language learning groups, and I just talked to people, and I was like, if I want to go about this, how do I do it? And everyone was like, sounds pretty manageable. All you got to do is do some outreach, hang up some posters, give some public talks to community centers, just like, make people aware that you're looking for someone with Alzheimer's disease, and you'll be able to, like, families will eventually come to you, and you'll be able to work with them. 100% not true. I did not get a single person that way. I started out, giving informal, like, talks about what Alzheimer's disease looks like in the garage, like the big garage of my host family. People showed up. They were very polite. Everyone was really interested to hear, what this guy from the US was saying about Alzheimer's disease. No one was ready to work with me just from that. Same thing. I'd talk to people. I'd have, I'd make, I'd go socialize. I'd say, do you know anyone who's older, who's living with Alzheimer's disease? People would say, oh, I'll get back to it, and I'll check with you. Did not work. So after a few months of kind of banging my head against the wall with these, more traditional methods, I started to recognize, all right, this is failing. So I contacted a few adult daycare centers and started working at a couple of them as a volunteer, just like to, get my feet on the ground into like a dementia space, essentially. And one of the centers that I volunteered at, there was a doctor there with funding to do Alzheimer's disease education, outreach, and treatment, non-pharmacological education, outreach, and treatment in this area. She was new to the area as well. She did not, her husband had moved their family there. And so she was not familiar with the city of Puebla either. And she was also struggling to get her recruiting going, because she also wanted to find people who were living with Alzheimer's disease who needed a little extra help, who maybe were slipping through the cracks. So we put our heads together, and through our combined contacts, we started to realize what was going on. And there's one moment that really stands out to me where I realized why I was failing at my recruitment. One of the senior centers that I tried to get to help me put me in touch with patients told me, we would love to do this, but we have a problem. We've already been sued twice for diagnosing someone with dementia. We have lawsuits pending against us for diagnosing someone with dementia. And so we're a little bit afraid to have a researcher come in and do dementia research. And I talked to an American who I knew, he was Mexican American. So he was living in Puebla. So he was able to explain to me that the reason they're getting sued is because there is a deep enough stigma around dementia with this older population that when you say the word demencia or Alzheimer, you're implying a craziness or locura. And so the families are very wary of having that label added, because they see it as craziness, as this person is going insane, especially the older generation. And so when I'm going out there and saying dementia, it's not going to get me anywhere, because that word automatically turns off anyone who's interested in participating in this kind of research. And so I needed to reframe this conversation. And I worked with the medical doctor who I was partnering with, who had the funding to do a little bit of outreach. And we realized that we could reframe this as normal versus abnormal aging. We did a charity walk in the area, and we did a quick survey, and we asked people what they knew about dementia, for example. And really no one was really able to define what dementia meant, and very few people ask for anything beyond very general information. So we started to realize there is a stigma and a dearth of knowledge. So what gap can we fill so that people are willing to talk to us? And we decided that a vignette approach, a normal versus abnormal aging framework, would work better. And so what we did was we contacted the social services that handled senior centers, that handled community events. This is actually my collaborator right here. And we set up a scenario where she would go and offer to meet with people, older people, and talk with them about their cognitive changes and identify anyone who may need additional help or who may want a diagnosis. And we did that by having her go up to the podium and read 3 vignettes. And I just took these, from like the typical vignette style psychological research, translated them to Spanish. She agreed that they were accurate for what dementia is. And so we had one vignette that was just normal aging, just like your typical cognitive changes as you're aging. We had a second vignette that was focused on MCI, and we had a third vignette that was focused specifically on a description of Alzheimer's disease. And we read those 3 vignettes to people, and we said, which one of these 3, if any, are concerning to you? And almost everyone raised their hand for almost every single vignette. And so there was not a distinction going on between normal aging, normal cognitive changes, and then even MCI. And at that point, we were then able to say, okay, well, actually, this first one is kind of normal. But do you all know anyone who looks like this third person who is acting like what we read about in this third vignette? And usually several people would raise their hands. It might even be someone in the room. At that point, we would say, if you're interested in learning more, come talk to us. Then the doctor and I would work, the physician and I would work together on interviewing the family. I'd do my qualitative anthropology style interview with some neuropsych testing, and she would do the medical side. And we'd offer them resources. We'd offer them referrals to adult daycares. If it was appropriate, she'd take them on as a patient at the hospital that she had an appointment at. But that was how I got most of my recruiting. Some of it was on the ground, but most of it came that way. I don't have a full hour, so I was going to belabor that point a little bit. This is the chapter that's coming out in January. I was, as an anthropologist, this was probably what I was most proud about, was figuring out how to get a hold of people who were struggling with cognitive changes and aging. Because I don't, that honestly, it took me a long time to figure out this one slide when I was actually living there. So once I had all those people, what was I doing with them? Like once I recruited them, what was going on? And I had a 2-step process for interviewing everyone. We're going to focus in on the caregiving interview I have here, as well as some of these neuropsych tests. This is the informant questionnaire on cognitive decline in the elderly and the neuropsychiatric inventory. We'll focus in on them a little bit more later on. In addition, I had all of the people who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I had them all wear a Fitbit for a week and collected sleep data in the United States. This was less practical in Mexico. I more often had to do my interview in one visit. So a lot of times I did this whole process over the course of like 5 or 6 hours in one day instead of splitting it up into 2. But in the United States, I also collected some sleep data to see if that would work in a home setting. Mixed results. Keep going. So some examples from the qualitative interviews of questions I asked that we're going to talk a little bit more about here are, what diagnosis does your family member have? Tell me about how you arrived at that diagnosis. And then there were more general questions like, what are your most important day-to-day caregiving strategies, and so forth. IRB approval from UMass, of course. They knew this whole recruiting thing I'm talking to you about. They were on board with it. I contacted my advisor constantly, telling her how the protocol was evolving. So we made sure that we were always up to snuff on the IRB side of things. I was recruiting dyads, as I hinted there before. I did a caregiver interview or care partner interview. I'm awful with language consistency. I apologize. A care partner interview and a neuropsych interview with the person living with Alzheimer's disease. Total duration, 2 to 5 hours. 2 hours is on the very low end, and sometimes even just a qualitative interview would be like an all-afternoon type of thing. Some people really like talk, especially if no one's asked them about their caregiving experiences before. I let the participant choose the location, but I guided them towards the interviews being at home. So in the United States, I think every single interview was at home, and I think in Mexico, like 29 out of 32 or something were in the home. People are more at ease when they're in the home. You also get a chance to see their environment. That allowed me to do some other cool things. Like I asked the person who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, can you show me your favorite object in the house? So I was able to do a little bit of like fake photo voice or object elicitation, that type of work. That's just honestly sitting on my laptop. I haven't figured out what to do with that yet. But being in the home allowed me to do that. So I'm kind of grateful that I had that opportunity. So that was the anthropological mind speaking again. I want to be where they are so I can see them acting. 62 total families participated. I think in the end, I talked to about 75 families. We threw a ton out, and in Mexico, we do the interview, realize this person absolutely did not have Alzheimer's disease, and I would, that would be the end of it for my participation with them. But in the end, 62 families in total qualified. In the U.S., it was, I think I tossed 2. They had formal Alzheimer's disease diagnoses, but when I got there, the diagnosis was from a PCP, and I started to do some of the, some of the memory testing, and no. Whereas in Mexico, that was, not nearly as consistent. There was a lot more of trying to figure out who did not have a diagnosis. Interviews were coded using in vivo. I did a 3-step iterative coding process. It's partially grounded theory, as well, with some explicit conceptual content analysis, which is who says what and how often. So that's what I'm going to be reporting here. We won't get into the grounded theory findings. We're going to stick explicitly with what people overtly told me, as well as the neuropsych battery, which I followed all standard procedures on that. The one exception is I used the Katz and Lawton-Brody scales, and I didn't ask people what they do on a day, like what they actually do. I asked what people were capable of doing to the care partner, and the goal there was to get a better understanding of what day-to-day capacities the person living with Alzheimer's disease. So here are some of the results. I'll draw your attention to the caregiver gender. In Mexico, it was 76, 3/4 women. In the United States, it was about 50-50 women to men. That's in line with, you also see the caregiver age is different, 53 versus 67. And a lot of that's attributable to the fact that I was looking at different relationships. Often child-parent relationship was more common in Mexico, 72% of the time, versus in the United States, it was 39% of the time. And so these numbers are a little more gender equitable, a little older, mostly because there's more spouses in this part of the sample than in the Mexico part. We can talk about what that means for my limitations. Nothing I can do about that in hindsight, obviously. I was doing convenient sampling, but I wanted to be straightforward with that. So, first research question: how long after the onset of initial symptoms and changes do care partners seek out a diagnosis? And right away, we already see that pattern that we're seeing in the literature, where in the United States, where people have better access to medical care, 2.2 years, whereas in Mexico, it took about 4 years. And this was statistically significant, 0.004. I think this is this was a non-parametric test. And then the standard deviation in Mexico was all over the place. I think I had one person that said like 10 years. And this was asked in hindsight. So I said, looking back now, how long after you first started to notice changes did you decide to take the person to the doctor to get a diagnosis? And so again, Mexico 4 years, United States 2 years. I was very happy with this United States number. You saw that study I put up where it said about 30-month latency from first symptom to diagnosis. This is very consistent with some of the other findings I found. So I do believe this US number. The Mexico number I think could be, I think this variability is probably true, where there's probably all over the place. And if we sampled 1,000 people, I think this number might change a little bit. I don't think it would get any smaller though. Why were people waiting to go to see a doctor? Let's focus in on Mexico a little bit. I am going to report more from the Mexico side than the US side. I think I found that a little more interesting. I noticed 4 themes. I'll go through each theme one by one and then summarize them at the end. So the qualitative explanations for why people waited a little while to go to the doctor were: first, early symptoms were not recognized as abnormal aging. There's this word viejita. In this part of Mexico, it essentially means like that cute old person. Like, like your stereotypical grandma, drawing a blank on pop culture grandmas, but imagine the grandma from your favorite TV show, not from The Sopranos, maybe a nicer show. That's what we're talking about here. That's what the stereotype means. About half of interviewees said this. And so we see this attitude, and this is again consistent with some of the other literature in other countries. Well, that's just part of getting older, right? Viejitas will forget things more often than you or me. It wasn't bothering her, so I didn't see a problem with it. Besides, what is the doctor going to do? So we're seeing here, this is just part of normal aging. You forget things as you get older. The next one aligns with some of the other findings that I was reporting, or some of the findings related to my methodology. The qualitative explanations for delay include a respect for the dignity of the person experiencing symptoms. 12 of 32 interviewees, so 38% of the sample, said that this was an explanation for why they didn't go see the doctor sooner. So there's this idea of locura, which means literally craziness. And you hear doctors all the time in this part of Mexico say, demencia no es una locura. Dementia is not a sign of craziness. Dementia is not synonymous with craziness, is the message they're trying to get across to people. Digging a little deeper, you start to see a gender difference here as well. There's a slight gender difference related to machismo, where for men, you see a lot of things like this first statement, where it took us a long time to talk about it with him and even longer for him to accept it. He sees himself as the head of the family and is not willing to lose that. It doesn't really matter. We can manage just fine. If it makes him feel better to not talk about it, then that's fine. So this idea where this head of the household would be slapped with a label of craziness and would no longer be the head of the household. The family, even though he was no longer functionally the head of the household, maybe, didn't want to take that symbolic label away from him. Whereas with the women, it was a little more work-based. It would break her heart. We just had to pretend like everything was normal. She's been taking care of everyone for so long, she would never accept that we have to take care of her now. And so this was very common with and they're all grandmothers, with these grandmothers in Mexico, where they have been a lot of them had very tough lives, to be quite honest. Like, domestic violence was incredibly common for this generation of older women in their 60s to their 80s in this part of Mexico. High levels of misogyny throughout, very few opportunities for work outside of the home, very little education. And so a lot of them, their social identity is built around maintaining the household, raising several kids, having, intergenerational family members come into the home and enjoy their cooking and whatnot. And so the concern is that if you tell them you have a diagnosis of Alzheimer, they may feel like they lose that, they'll be afraid they'll lose that ability to continue to do that, to continue to function as that, that silent matriarch within the household. The reason was people waited until symptoms were disrupting daily life. This came up as the primary reason in 34% of interviews. We didn't see a need to go to the doctor for several years. She wasn't as capable as before, but she was still able to help out. Besides, she was happy. Why bother her with the doctor's visit? But when she started getting up in the middle of the night, every night it got to be too much. I was struggling to sleep and she kept waking up the kids. It was a problem. Lastly, some participants sought out diagnosis, but were misdiagnosed or they were unable to find proper medical help. We went back to the same clinic at least 10 times. Mom has changed and we know something's wrong. She can barely even cook anymore, but the blank, probably pendejo, kept telling us everything is fine and she's getting old. Look at these scans we did, but they keep saying they look normal. I don't know what to do anymore. This family stands out for me for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was these two sisters, probably about in their 30s, living together with their two parents, and it was the only household in all of Mexico where I was offered a Natty Light when I came in as a drink, it was like literally the only beer like that I saw in all of Mexico. So like that case of like college frat boy beer in this random house in central Mexico will always stand out to me because they all drink, like they all drink, typical Mexican style beer for the most part at social gatherings. Like it's very common to see. I could not wrap my head around why that beer was in this house with these two 30-something women, whatever. The pertinent point here is that these two women had they knew something was wrong with their mom. She had been showing disturbing to them cognitive and behavioral changes for several years. And they were pretty well off. Like, I think there was a Mercedes, there was a nice car in the driveway. Like, this was not a family that was struggling for money in any way. It was in a gated community, very nice, big house. This is why I like to do the interviews in the home, by the way. But they couldn't find someone in the private clinics who would give them a definitive diagnosis. And it was interesting from a material culture standpoint because they pulled out a stack of imaging scans this big, and I did not look through them, but they clearly were doing everything all the way up to getting imaging, and they still paying for it themselves probably, they still couldn't get a diagnosis. And my collaborator was able to diagnose their mother with Alzheimer's disease. It was a cut and dried, very straightforward case for my collaborator to diagnose. She said, this probably isn't even mixed. Like, this is like classic Alzheimer's disease. So I've always wondered, like, why were they and how were they not getting diagnoses? And I never got a good answer to that question during my fieldwork. The only thing I can do is kind of think back to that text message I got from that nursing home coordinator and imagine that maybe some doctors are hesitant to give these diagnoses because they don't want to, either they don't want to open themselves up to frustration from the family and possibly lose a patient, or they don't want to be applying the stigma themselves. It's the only explanation I can come up with for why this was happening. And it wasn't just one family, it was about a quarter of the families I spoke with. So what symptoms or changes motivate individuals or care partners to seek out a diagnosis? So that was explaining why people wait to get a diagnosis. And then I would ask them to identify, like, what was the primary reason you went? Like, what was the motivating symptom, the motivating change that pushed you to finally go get that diagnosis? And, or not finally, I hope I didn't say it like that there, to go get that diagnosis at that time. United States, I saw about half of participants were saying memory symptoms. Classic explanation, repeating the same sentence in the same paragraph, or losing train of thought, like that. Very common explanations. Whereas in Mexico, I had a higher focus on neuropsychiatric symptoms. And overall, though, I would like to draw attention to the fact that it's more diffuse where these explanations are coming from. And I found that fascinating because it spoke to me about, I was thinking back to the delay, like 2 years versus 4 years. Like, why is there a difference there? And one reason seems to be because in the United States, as soon as someone shows a memory problem, they're like, bam, we're going off to the doctor. Whereas in Mexico, those explanations for delaying, those cultural explanations, kind of put more of an emphasis on when there's a disruption to the household. And as I'm guessing all the clinicians know, these neuropsychiatric symptoms can very rapidly become very disrupting to the household. And so at that point, grandma's acting out, got to go to the doctor. That seemed to be the primary motivator. But overall, there were several different reasons in Mexico, whereas in the United States, it was consistently more often memory problems. And this category of disruptive to the household / caregiver, I've gotten some pushback on that one. I could probably lump it into the neuropsychiatric symptoms. I've been encouraged to go back and reconsider a couple of these classifications, which I'm in the process of doing. For now, let's keep going here. So what does those neuropsychiatric symptoms look like? So what was fascinating to me as I read through this was that the explanations within each category did not vary very much. So maybe people are going to the US maybe people are going to the doctor in the US more often because of memory symptoms. When we talk about neuropsych symptoms, there wasn't that much difference if that was the motivating factor between those two. And so that experience seems to be it doesn't seem to be different, but it seems to be differentially emphasized in the household, is how I would interpret that. So for example, in Mexico, with my grandmother, the problem was he would get mad with my grandmother because he thought she was disagreeing with everything he said and devaluing him. Me, was it always like that? Participant, no, this was different. They never used to fight, at least as far as I knew. So what happened? We tried to slow things down, tell him to ignore her or not to pay attention. But eventually my mom decided it was time to go see a doctor. So the granddaughter of the person living with Alzheimer's was in high school, and she wanted to practice her English with me. So this is actually a verbatim one. I gave her a chance to translate for her mother. I recorded both though to make sure the translation was accurate. Moving on, in the United States, 2 weeks after she got done with physical therapy, all of a sudden she just starts yelling from her bathroom at night, "Where are they? Where are they?" First, I had no idea what she was talking about, but eventually I realized, oh great, now she's hallucinating. There's also that outburst in here as well, though. The yelling was really caught this person's attention. But they did emphasize the hallucinating here. I knew we needed to go to some kind of specialist then. So very similar story. Someone starts to have some kind of behavioral disorder, some kind of behavioral change that is coded as disordered in the household in Mexico and the United States. And so once that change is coded as disordered, then it's time to go see a doctor. Whereas in Mexico, they're not coding the memory symptoms as disordered. That idea, again, of viejitas. So is this all related to just a stage difference? Was I just finding people in the United States who were just earlier on in the illness? And so every single difference I detected in the entire project comes down to the fact that people are at different stages of the illness when I talk to them. And when I ran these numbers, and I'm sure some people here will have some critiques and I'll try to address them, but I was honestly quite thrilled because these numbers came out way better than I expected looking at the neuropsych data. So this first test here, we have this perceived memory impairment, and this is the informant questionnaire on cognitive decline in the elderly. And so the care partner is reporting this. Crucially, we're talking about care partner perceptions, driving decision-making around diagnosis seeking. And so I like this test because it's asking specifically about memory impairment as perceived by the care partner. No statistical difference here whatsoever. Mean score of 4.2 in Mexico, mean score of 4.3 to each item mean score of 4.3 in the United States for each participant. p-value 449. This is the, I always get this acronym wrong, and I bought it from Duke, so I bought this test from Duke, so I should get it better. This is the Consortium to Establish a Registry of Alzheimer's Disease Neuropsychiatric Portion. So it's just one of those comprehensive neuropsych exams that does different types of memory testing, Boston naming testing, the line drawing test and so forth, or the picture identification test and so forth. And so what I found here was out of a score of, I believe this one's out of 100, 34.6 in the US, 34.4 in Mexico. Flip that, 34.5-ish in each, actually. No difference whatsoever. Huge variation here. But I believe this one was normally distributed. I got pushback on using the mini mental recently, so I could easily delete this line, but I like to highlight it because 17.9 versus 17.1. So even if you just use this as a screening tool and you assume under 20 is a moderate level of impairment, and then I forget, what is it, 12 or 13 is significant level of impairment, they're still falling into the same general bucket. And again, standard deviation is huge, but the distribution was very similar between these. Last one I want to draw your attention to is frequency and severity of neuropsych symptoms. And this is the calculation from the neuropsychiatric inventory. 17 versus 20 as a total score. P equals 0.789. And so remember, we're talking about how those neuropsych symptoms seem to have a different level of hold a different level of pertinence in the diagnosis seeking behavior. What was fascinating to me was that when I did the NPI, there was no difference in frequency and severity between Mexico and the United States. But on the NPI for caregiver distress, caregivers in Mexico reported that these symptoms were more distressing than caregivers in the United States. And so what we're seeing is some consistency with those qualitative answers and my interpretation of these quantitative answers, where caregivers in Mexico are more often motivated by that behavioral change, that NPI type of change, and it's more distressing. I think a lingering question, which I need to dig a little more into, is kind of, what's the chicken and what's the egg here? Are the caregivers in the US less distressed by those NPI symptoms because they've gotten a diagnosis in an earlier stage, so they were more prepared? Or is there some cultural difference here between the two? So that's on my long-term to-do list as I work on these manuscripts, and I want to dig in a little more into this difference down the line. Last thing, I included those two activities of daily living scales. There's some people in the literature who will combine the two scales together, the instrumental ADLs and the ADLs. And I did that here to see if there was a difference. And again, I deviated slightly from norms on how this is done. I asked the care partner, is the person capable of doing this? And that was because in Mexico, a lot of those ADL questionnaires just don't work because you say something like, does so-and-so cook their own meals? Or so-and-so capable of cooking their own meals? And they look at you like, well, no, but he never cleaned the house. So why would he start cleaning the house now when he's 85? So I kind of had to try to control for that a little bit. But what we're seeing is that in Mexico, higher score on the ADLs, people were actually more active, theoretically contributing more to the household in Mexico than they were in the United States, despite a reverse trend in caregiver distress. So here's some summary. Question 1, how long after the onset of initial symptom change do care partners seek out a diagnosis? Latency from symptom onset to diagnosis was significantly longer in Mexico than in the United States. Explanations for delays included symptoms classified as normal aging, respecting the dignity of the elder, symptoms not considered disruptive, and lack of access to appropriate biomedical care. Again, this is an exclusive to Mexico finding reported in this particular box. Secondly, what symptoms or changes motivates care partners to seek out diagnosis? In the US, memory symptoms most often prompted diagnosis, but in Mexico, neuropsychiatric symptoms were the most common motivator. No difference between US and Mexico in memory, cognition, and neuropsychiatric symptoms. People living with Alzheimer's in Mexico had higher mean ADLs. In other words, they may have been more functional. I wouldn't say, I should add a may in there. They might be more functional. And despite similar neuropsych symptom severity, care partners in Mexico reported higher levels of stress. Wrap it up with a quick discussion section. So what we're seeing here, my takeaway here is that we have the same symptoms, but different caregiver response in terms of distress, help seeking, and symptom management. This is reflective of a biocultural model. In other words, you could argue that people interact with elders experiencing cognitive changes differently in the United States and Mexico, which affects how the AD is embodied. Real easy one there is we could probably document differing levels of stigma and education among the general populace on Alzheimer's disease and other dementias between the two countries. Follow-up is that many of the familial caregivers did not match the symptoms to diagnosis to meaning model that is often described. Mexican families acknowledge a behavior as disturbing at a different point in the disease trajectory than in the US. For example, behavioral symptoms are more likely to be considered problematic than memory symptoms, or more likely to motivate diagnosis. Maybe a better way to phrase that. And this broadly aligns with Broussard and Carpenter's distinction in the sociological literature between an anticipation diagnosis in the US. So you go to the doctor because you see a problem coming down the road, because you think something's starting to happen, maybe not that quite disturbing yet, but you want to cut it off at the pass, versus an emergency diagnosis in Mexico, where you go to the doctor because, oh geez, we got to get grandma some help. Like, what are we going to do with her? Emergency diagnosis. So a future question I think here is unpacking these data a little more deeply to talk about when is the most beneficial time for a diagnosis when earlier symptoms are not generally considered problematic within the local sociocultural context. So what I'm saying here is, at what point is a diagnosis most effective in Mexico? If you diagnose someone early on in the disease process, is that going to place such a huge label of stigma on them that it negatively affects their quality of living from a day-to-day perspective? And crucially, they may not have access to consistent specialized memory care in a public hospital, for example, or the wait times may be inordinate to the point that it takes them so long to get in the system that adding that stigma label does more damage than they can be helped initially. And so I think there's probably, my guess, my sociological guess is there's probably a sweet spot here where there's a middle ground between when the symptoms begin to disrupt the household or become dangerous, and when that label of stigma then is less of a concern. And that getting the Alzheimer's disease diagnosis can actually lead to some good medical help because you're far enough along that the MDs in the area are now able to give you more specialized care, versus maybe an earlier diagnosis isn't necessarily as helpful right away, which I'm guessing is probably antithetical to some of the training that some of the clinicians have had. And so that's kind of something I'm mulling over in my head as I read these conversations in the interdisciplinary literature on how diagnoses affect people and how we navigate that type of framework in different cultures. Citations no one ever reads. Last thing, anyone wants to collaborate, let me know. My postdoc at the Cook Center is finishing up at the end of May, so also forward me your job postings, the usual. I think that's all I have, so I'm ready for questions if anyone has any.
Oh, great, Eric. Thank you so very much. It's a really, really interesting project and presentation, and I really do applaud you for it, because I think it's really it's just fascinating. So let's see, do we have some folks who want to ask some questions? I believe we do. Mary Ann.
Hi, Eric. Wonderful presentation. It is fantastic. It kind of, for those of you who are at Grand Rounds in psychiatry, it kind of flows with the theme of what we've been talking about today. So I'm going to make a disclosure. I'm from Costa Rica, so I train as a physician down there. So you could have given me a call and I could have answered some of those questions you had. I was on my phone initially, so I don't know if I missed this, but did you look at differences by sex?
I didn't have enough power to do that. Yeah, I did at the beginning. I can pull up though the numbers. Let's see. So in the US, the patient gender was 68% women, and in Mexico was 76% women. So I had predominantly women in both places by about 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio.
Okay, because I asked this because I think all this work that you've done really will vary depending on that, composition. Just because in Mexico or any Central American country, it's hard to find a man that's going to take care of the woman, right? It's almost impossible. So I think that the way the system works and the way people are going to report the symptoms and all of this that you've gone over will vary greatly depending on who you're asking. The other note I had here, so I come from a family from a very poor background, and they're also, unfortunately, a lot of them have had Alzheimer's disease. And I can tell you that the stigma is real and people don't want to come out with it. It's kind of, we can deal with it. I don't know if it's a power dynamic within the family of, oh, we can take care of this as long as possible. So that is one thing. However, the other big thing that you did, I just want to say you did a great job pointing it out, is from the physician standpoint, unfortunately, there's a lot of people wanting to take advantage of this population, and they want to just delay that diagnosis as much as they can, just so that they can keep getting, you know, that extra income for them. So I don't know how in science we can control for that or how we can deal with that, but that's a huge issue, especially for middle to higher income families. I noticed that they do all the tests from, you know, like you're saying, everything under the radar, and they still won't give a diagnosis. And it's just, I don't know if it's a comforting thing for the family to not have that diagnosis and we're still trying to do something about it, or it's just, I don't know. But anyway, so that was a good point. And the last comment I had is I wouldn't drill you so much on the MMSE, because all the population studies that have been done in Central America actually have the MMSE as the score. So it's actually good because you could compare across cohorts. So good for that. So thank you.
That's why I use that one, because I saw that score coming up a lot, and my score is consistent with some of the other findings that I've seen. So yeah, I appreciate that you noticed that. Thank you very much. And I really like the point about the caregiver gender. I think I have 4 men in Mexico, and they were all sons to mothers. And I'm seeing more case studies show up in the, you know, in a lot, and more qualitative case studies show up in a lot of, you know, like high impact factor journals. And so I've been contemplating pulling out those 4 interviews and reanalyzing them in isolation, because I agree with you. I think those 4 are probably different from the other interviews I did in Mexico.
I have a question, and then Maria, I'll let you go first.
No, go ahead. I can wait. No worries.
I'll be brief, but so it's intriguing. Well, it makes sense that the family will become more interested in the situation when there's behavioral disturbance and so forth. But why do you think the memory issue is not prominent? Or did you get a sense there that the memory bothers the caregiver, or that is bothersome, even though it is not necessarily disruptive? I was just curious about that. It's maybe a little too, you know, much of a threading the needle, but I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to do. So let me preface. I do have a question in my qualitative data about which symptom bothered you the most. So I do ask caregivers which ones bother them the most. I cannot remember off the top of my head where memory is on that hierarchy, because it was not nearly as cut and dried as these reasons for going to the doctor. I think some of it is that idea that old people forget things, so there's that normalcy of memory loss being part of aging. So I think that's probably what I'd fall back on. There's also there's not really a distinction between different types of memory impairment. And so if you find a person with TBI and you talk about Alzheimer, you'll get a non-zero number of people who will say, oh, that guy over there, he smacked his head, you know, he smacked his head in a car accident. He's had Alzheimer ever since. So as an anthropologist, I am not prepared to say that we're even using the word the same way between the two countries in all contexts. And so I don't know. I feel like that answer probably needs a much deeper consideration before I'm ready to give a good one.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, Maria.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Eric. Just first to congratulate you, because this is amazing work. I think it's great. I'm struck by, you know, your commitment to this population and to this question and everything like you've done to try to advance the field with your work. So I think it's fantastic. I think and I think you posed a really good question at the end of like, why do we need to give a diagnosis? What's the best time to do that, especially in this population? And I don't have a good answer for that. Just I'd start with that. But I think it's a really good question. And I think what maybe I can add, and I'm sure you've already thought about this, is that it probably depends, right? And even within this population, it depends. And I think kind of as Marianne brought up earlier, sex might be an important factor, right? Into who is being diagnosed. I think the rest of the family, who else is in the family, what else is happening, at what point does something become disruptive, right? I could see how, maybe milder memory problems could be very disruptive if you have a, single woman caring for 5 children and also having to care for a grandmother that cannot help out anymore. That can already be disruptive. You know what I mean? And so I think thinking about the family context might provide some answers to that. Thinking about another thing you brought up, the socioeconomic status of the families, maybe that also is a factor into not only who gets the diagnosis, and maybe the other way around of what we might expect here, maybe, but also, who would have the means to get help further down the line, and what would that help look like? So in any case, those are my thoughts as you're trying to answer those questions of, thinking about it depends, and the differences within the different families. I know, you don't have very large groups, but that could be a next step, right? So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that comment because I had people draw out their family tree and then point out to me anyone in the past who had Alzheimer's disease, or who they suspected had Alzheimer's disease. And I'll never be able to report this because I don't have enough data from Mexico, but most of the families that I was talking with in Mexico had someone else from a previous generation who had some exposure to Alzheimer's disease. And so I do think you're right, where there's a family dynamic going on here, where they may have seen someone who had cognitive decline in a previous generation, and that kind of spooked them because it's it sucks, to have to take care of someone. So they may have been aware of what was coming down the road. Is kind of I would love to have more data to dig into that. But I think that probably is a major factor. Like previous exposure within the family, I think, is affecting a lot of people's decision making.
Truly interesting. We have 1 minute left. So any burning questions anyone has, now would be the time to raise your hand. Don't see any. So if not, Eric, I just want to thank you again for an absolutely fascinating talk that really is very important, and really enjoyed hearing about it, and wish you great luck as you continue on your work. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And great to see everybody here. So delighted that you were able to make it, and look forward to another great ideas forum in about a month. And you'll be hearing from Michelle and Jackie. So keep on the lookout. Kyle, any last words? Super.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks again, Eric.
Yeah.
Right.
Good night, everyone.